much at the forefront of providing to our Ukrainian friends.
So Julian Lewis.
Is it not time that both sides of this House came together to agree on a common policy of increasing defence expenditure so that by increasing our support for Ukraine, we can set an example to our American allies without whose help there is no future for peace and security in Europe?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my colleagues on the opposition front bench know that I try not to throw gratuitous punches in the House, and I know that they are enthusiasts for military spending, but their colleague, the Shadow Chancellor, has thus far declined to say that she will do anything other than the 2% target on NATO spending, which is not the same as the government is currently spending, nor what the government currently intends to increase spending to. So the Right Honourable Gentleman's suggestion is timely, and it would be fantastic if over the course of the next hour the Right Honourable Shadow Secretary of State were to make the same commitment as we have.
Let's try now then. Shadow Secretary of State John Healey.
Well, Mr. Speaker, of course, in the last Labour year of the last government, we were spending 2.5% of GDP on defence, a level that's never been matched in any of the 14 Tory years since. Mr. Speaker, the Labour leader and I were at Munich, like the Defence Secretary at the weekend, and the urgency of more help for Ukraine ran through every discussion. And everyone was also profoundly moved by Yulia Navalny, speaking even after the news of her husband's death at Putin's hands. This is the brutality the Ukrainians are fighting. This is why UK support must not falter. So we strongly back last month's UK-Ukraine security agreement. The Defence Secretary calls it a 100-year alliance. So will the government take the necessary next step with an implementation plan for this year and future years to make sure Ukraine gets the help it needs now and for tomorrow?
Well, Mr. Speaker, whilst grateful for the history lesson on what was spent under the previous Labour government, the commitment to match the government's spending in a future government was conspicuously absent from the Right Honourable Gentleman's answer. However, back to the collegiate spirit within which defence questions is normally conduct himself, I absolutely agree that the horizon the Secretary of State set out in his speech for the partnership with Ukraine absolutely requires a strategic approach to be taken with very long horizons set for what our cooperation, both industrial and military, could look like.
John Healey.
Well, long horizons are fine, but Ukraine needs more help now. And I'm concerned about this 2.5 billion for Ukraine, announced last month and described by the Prime Minister, as the Minister says, as the biggest single package of defence aid to Ukraine since the war began. In an answer to my question last week, however, the Minister would not rule out using this money to cover the UK's own operational costs at NATO bases. So will he today rule that out? Will he today confirm that every penny and every pound of this 2.5 billion for Ukraine will go to Ukraine?
Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman, I fear, has missed something over the last 2 years, because the 2.3 billion that the government has provided in support of operations to support Ukraine has always included both the gifting in kind that takes the headlines, but also Operation Interflex and other avenues through which we support the Ukrainians. So the fact is that next year's spending and the year after will match exactly what we did in previous years in terms of the breadth of that contribution. It's also true, Mr. Speaker, that both the long-term strategic alliance that the Secretary of State set out and the commitment year on year to spend more than any other European ally are not mutually exclusive. We're doing both.
SNP spokesperson Martin Docherty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, on the 17th of March at the Munich conference, Prime Minister Frederiksen of the Kingdom of Denmark actually stated, if you ask a Ukrainian, they're asking for ammunition now, artillery now. From the Danish side, we decided to donate our entire artillery. Doesn't the Secretary of State agree, or at least the Minister, that allies should be a little more like Denmark when it comes to recognising the consequences of not meeting Ukraine's needs?
So, Mr. Speaker, we're full of admiration for our Danish colleagues. But the reality is that the UK has provided almost its entire heavy artillery capability in terms of AS-90. Those that we've held behind are those that service the battle group in Estonia and the very high readiness armoured battle group. Similarly, we've been generous with our ammunition stocks whilst retaining those that we need for our VHR forces. More than that, we've catalysed the production of 155mm ammunition in the UK, and even further, we have been buying up as much 152 and 122mm ammunition around the world as we possibly can. The UK's contribution to the Ukrainian artillery fight is not confined to what we had within our own ammunition stockpiles. It is much, much bigger and amounts to hundreds of thousands of rounds.
Martin Docherty.
Well, I'm afraid I have to say, Mr. Speaker, to paraphrase a former member, the government's response, I think, is weighted in the balance and found wanting. So with the Czech Republic's profound donations of artillery and shells on top of the Danish donation, as well as a commitment of over 1 million from the EU, I wonder if the Minister, and I hope he can come up to the dispatch box and correct the balance and advise the House in terms of his new investment, and it is welcome, in terms of the new investment, how much of that is in tactical armaments and in artillery?
So the overseas ammunition acquisition plan from previous years remains broadly as it was, which amounts to about 300,000 rounds bought on international markets and provided to Ukraine. The 155mm manufacture acceleration is subject to a different funding package that the Secretary of State and his Ukrainian counterpart have been working on. But it's important to note, Mr. Speaker, that the 200 million additional money from last year to this is focused on the provision of drones, and it is those tactical drones that are proving to be most significant in terms of the impact they're having in the battle space.
Scott Benton.
Question 3, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, the latest full-time strength of the Army is 73,520. The Army is continuing to work towards its future soldier structure of 73,000 regular and 30,000 reserve personnel. There are no current plans to change this. And good news, Mr. Speaker, provisional figures suggest that January had the highest number of Army applications for 6 years.
Scott Benton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Media reports have suggested that white men have been actively discriminated against in recruitment and that security checks may be relaxed due to promoting ethnic diversity within the Army. A number of senior military figures have purportedly warned that the pervasiveness of woke ideology being pushed onto the armed forces is a real and present threat to national security and will give aid and comfort to the King's enemies. Will the planned review of diversity policies seek to address these concerns?
Well, I'm very grateful for the honourable gentleman's remarks. I don't recognise the situation he describes. We take security extremely seriously and ensure all personnel have security clearance appropriate to their job. Checks normally require at least 3 years UK residency, but Commonwealth candidates are permitted to accrue qualifying residency while serving, although they cannot take up roles and ranks which require higher levels of vetting. This policy has been in place for several years and it hasn't changed.
Tonya Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Look, figures in the Times last month showed that the British Army will shrink to as small as 67,000 by 2026 due to the current crisis in recruitment and retention. As threats to the UK are increasing, will the Minister finally commit to halting these cuts that he is continuing to make to the Army?
Well, the government is sticking to 73,000 regular and 30,000 reserve personnel, as I said earlier. Those figures were contained in Future Soldier, published in 2021, and remains unchanged.
Jack Brereton.
Number 4, Mr. Speaker.
Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, the Ministry of Defence continues to stand ready to support the FCDO-led effort to pursue land, air, maritime routes to delivering urgently needed humanitarian aid.
Jack Brereton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Many of my constituents in Stoke-on-Trent South are extremely concerned about the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and want to see much more aid getting into Gaza. This is vitally needed by the innocent civilian population in Gaza. So will the Secretary of State update us on what more is being done to get additional routes into Gaza, and particularly to get a sea route for humanitarian aid into those innocent civilians?
Well, my honourable friend will be pleased to know that I've been to the region on a number of occasions, visiting Israel, Cyprus twice, Egypt, Saudi, with the specific intention of trying to resolve the problem that he describes. We've delivered 150 tonnes of aid already, but the problem is getting the aid into the country, or into Gaza, I should say. Although we've persuaded the Israelis to open Kerem Shalom, we desperately need Ashdod opened as well, and then we can create a humanitarian aid route from Cyprus, which we've discussed with the Cypriots, direct to Ashdod and straight in via Kerem Shalom.
Andrew Salu.
Number 5, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, families are an integral part of the armed forces community. Our commitment to them remains strong and reinforced through the Haythorne-Thwaite Review and Defence Command Paper and Refresh, the family strategy published in January 2022, set out this government's response, and my honourable friend's excellent Living in Our Shoes framework for delivering more family-sympathetic policies.
Andrew Salu.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The families of armed forces personnel have to put up with more separation, relocation and danger to their loved ones than any other public servant, and they often feel slightly disenfranchised. They might not know who their Member of Parliament is. They might fear to approach them for the impact that might have on their spouse or partner's career. So does he agree with me it's incredibly important that there is public visibility on following through on the 86 recommendations the Ministry of Defence accepted in full and the 20 which were accepted in part?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I have slightly different numbers. My honourable friend will be interested to hear on the number of accepted. I have 106 out of 110 from his report. Regardless of the exact numbers, I entirely agree with him about the importance of making sure that armed forces families live in accommodation which is decent, that when we ask them to go and fight abroad, when they come home, they have good living accommodation. He'll be pleased to hear that the steering group that he'll be very familiar with, which includes families, federations and authors of my honourable friend's excellent report, meets again on the 28th of this month.
Mr. Speaker, with permission, I would like to answer questions 6, 7, 12 and 19 together. In a challenging labour market, we continue to apply an array of measures to support recruitment and retention and refine the armed forces offer. These include the biggest pay rise in 20 years, flexible service and an improved accommodation offer. The Haythorne-Thwaite Review has a key part to play, and teams have been stood up across defence to implement all 67 recommendations, working to establish a reward and incentivisation architecture that will attract and retain the skills we need.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful for that answer. But it's also true that the quality of forces accommodation is an important factor in both recruitment and retention of the armed forces. Would my right honourable friend consider giving local commanders greater agency to get small repairs done locally if the national contractors fail to act quickly enough?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Heads of establishment can access an approved funding pot to address minor maintenance works up to a maximum value of £25,000 per item, and that's extremely helpful and gets away from some of the bureaucracy that's involved with the prime contractors.
Sarah Atherton.
Mr. Speaker, 7 experienced personnel are leaving to 5 being recruited. Despite efforts being placed on diversity and inclusion policies, some in my opinion being counterproductive, in addition to Capita's initiatives, last year there was a net loss of 310 servicewomen to the military. Falling rates of retention is overshadowing operational effectiveness. Can the Minister outline what he's doing for retention?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend and predecessor. Over the past 2 years, Defence has put servicewomen at the heart of the development and delivery of a range of initiatives, as you well know, knows from uniform policies, provision of accessible sanitary products, mentoring, the introduction of flexible service, wraparound childcare, parental leave, zero tolerance to unacceptable behaviours, and further measures in response to Wigston, Gray and my honourable friend's report. I pay tribute to those who have been driving change, but it's far from job done.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The armed forces, including the 14 signal regiments based in Pembrokeshire, continue to provide fabulous career opportunities for young people. So does my right honourable friend agree with me that now more than ever we need to encourage army visits into schools, and that the long campaign by nationalists in Wales to stop those kind of visits actually damages social mobility and aspirations?
Yeah, I entirely share my right honourable friend's enthusiasm. The armed forces is a huge engine for social mobility. The Army achieved over 5,000 school engagement visits from across the United Kingdom in the last year, each at the school's request. The British Army is the public's army. It is important it engages with the people it serves, despite the best efforts of some on the left and the nationalists to which he refers.
Louis French.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The London Borough of Bexley is home to a number of excellent cadet and reserve units which teach vital life skills. Could the Minister please update the House on progress on the cadet expansion programme and what work is being undertaken to strengthen the pathways into His Majesty's Armed Forces?
Mr. Speaker, I am very grateful for the opportunity to do so. The Joint Ministry of Defence and Department for Education Cadet Expansion Programme is progressing extremely well. We currently have over 54,000 cadets in school cadet units. The Cadet Expansion Programme has focused on growth in the state sector. Since introduction in 2012, the number of cadet units in state schools has grown by over 400%, 268 schools. Some new units have also been opened in independent schools, and here there has been a 12% increase. I'm sure my honourable friend would join me in welcoming that transformation.
Sir Strathern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Local service personnel routinely cite to me issues in service accommodation as a big barrier to recruitment and retention. So I was really disappointed to hear that the government has no plans to improve the quality of the near 900 SLA accommodation bed spaces in my constituency at Chicktowns that currently fall into the lowest grades before the base closes. Will the Minister commit to revisiting this decision to make sure we do right by all service personnel serving on the base before it closes?
The gentleman is absolutely right to highlight the importance of service accommodation. He will be aware, I hope, of the huge investment that government is putting in to not only improving the quality of service family accommodation, but also service living accommodation. Our people deserve the best. I think it's public knowledge that they have not had the best for some considerable time. We are absolutely committed to remedying that, including for his constituents.
Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, doesn't the Minister wake up in the morning sometimes and check on reality? The fact of the matter is we have had seven Secretary of State for Defence since 2010, absolute turmoil in our armed forces, and the fact of the matter is, why would people join the British Army when a government like this has run us down to 72,000 serving officers? 72! I used to campaign when you took it below 100,000. Wake up and invest in the defence of our country in a troubled world.
Well, those are interesting reflections, aren't they, Mr. Speaker? I suggest he has a word with his front bench, and in particular the Shadow Chancellor, who to date has failed to commit to the level of spending on the defence of this country that this party, this side, is completely committed to.
Andrew Bridgen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The rise of so-called woke culture has been infecting our society for many years, and it should be unsurprising that it's now infecting our military. Does the Minister think that the rise of woke makes it easier or more difficult to recruit the right sort of people into our armed forces?
Well, I completely reject the premise of my honourable friend's question. If he's talking about increasing the amount of women in our armed forces, if he's talking about Lord Etherton's review into LGBT historically in our armed forces, if he's talking about our ambition to make our armed forces more reflective of the society from which they're drawn and which they serve, then, Mr. Speaker, I'm as guilty as charged.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister for his answer? Minister, you and I will be aware, and many others will be aware, that across Northern Ireland, recruitment to the services, be it the Army, the RAF or the Royal Navy, was always exceptional. To ensure that that continues, the TA regiments are at a figure and a number where they can't go above. What I was suggesting, Mr. Speaker, is that maybe here the MOD and the Minister should look at a possibility of increasing those numbers of TA soldiers to ensure that the recruitment levels in Northern Ireland can exceed the numbers that are already there.
Well, I'm very grateful. It gives me the opportunity, Mr. Speaker, paying tribute to people of Northern Ireland who, as he says, have contributed disproportionately to the defence of our country. He will know that we're committed to growing our reserve forces, and of course that means reserve forces right across our United Kingdom.
Minister Luke Pollard.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 24,000 fewer troops, 4,000 fewer sailors, 200 less aircraft, and 1 in 5 ships removed. The Conservatives have failed our armed forces over the last 14 years, missing their recruitment target every year since taking power in 2010 and hollowing out our military. Does the Minister honestly believe he can look the public in the eye and claim 5 more years will fix the mess that they have created, or is it time for a fresh start?
Oh, I think the honourable gentleman knows what I'm going to say in response to his question, and that is to invite him to have a conversation with the Shadow Chancellor to commit to the same level of spending on defence as this government is committed to and is spending right now. Is he going to make a spending commitment here and now in the House of Commons? If so, I'm all ears.
Can I also suggest it is for the government not to be asking the questions, it's for the opposition. Dame Caroline Docherty.
Mr. Speaker, please.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Rotary Wing Enterprise Programme seeks to improve aircraft availability across support solutions for Apache, Chinook, Merlin and Wildcat from within existing budgets. It will do so by driving synergies between platforms, modernising support solutions and pursuing delivery-focused commercial mechanisms. Sir.
Caroline Dinage.
Mr. Speaker, as you know, Fleetlands in Gosport has been the home of military helicopter maintenance for over 65 years, and this highly skilled engineering work is really key to levelling up the area, providing much needed jobs and opportunity. But does the Minister agree with me that actually the MOD's Rotary Wing Enterprise and New Medium Helicopter Programme actually would benefit greatly from these generations of expertise and skills right there in Gosport?
Well, I know from my recent visit that my honourable friend is a champion not only for defence in her constituency, but in particular for defence jobs. She's right about Standard Aero at Fleetlands Gosport, which is a valued actor in the maintenance of our rotary wing platforms. In terms of the specific rotary wing enterprise, this is due to enter its detailed design this year, sir. As part of this, it will consider wider social value, including the extent to which economic prosperity is supported. But as this is a specific potential procurement, I cannot comment. And likewise, on new medium helicopter, we cannot comment on the role of particular companies, but we hope to say more on this very soon.
Shadow Minister Maria Riedel.
Speaker, the government's delayed producing information required for the invitation to negotiate for the new medium lift helicopter 4 times since September 2022. So can he explain what's caused this 18-month delay? And given the reports last week about his department freezing capital spending until at least the new financial year, when are the government going to get their act together to get this competition underway? Can you promise that the delay won't push back the delivery date for this vital capability for our forces?
Well, 2 things I'm pleased to say. First of all, we will have the announcement on the next stage of new medium helicopter very, very soon. And I'm pleased to also confirm that we've been clear on our spending position. Perhaps to echo my honourable friend, if the honourable lady wants to talk about stuff that's rumoured in the press and we don't have those sorts of capital spending controls, she could confirm that the Shadow Chancellor is going to honour our spending on the Ministry of Defence.
Giles Watling.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Number 9, if you please.
Mr. Speaker, AUKUS partners continue to make very good progress on the optimal pathway to deliver conventionally armed nuclear-powered submarines to Australia and to develop the advanced capabilities required.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I thank my right honourable friend for his answer. AUKUS is a bold project which rightfully identifies the greater need for cooperation in the Pacific between our great nations. However, I don't think it should be limited to just defence. In my own report for the 1922 Foreign Affairs Policy Committee, we found that there's not only a need, but an appetite for wider scope, inclusion of Canada, for example. Does my honourable friend agree that AUKUS cannot be just about defence policy? And are we reaping the maximum benefits for Britain by consigning to this being just a defence procurement exercise? I mean, where is the FCOD in all this?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right to say that AUKUS can and should be a programme which extends beyond the 3 core nations, the UK, the US and Australia. But that is very much a matter for the Pillar 2 arrangements rather than the Pillar 1, which the House will know is the nuclear-powered submarine for Australia and that joint procurement. And he'll be pleased to hear that in, I think it was November, I was in the US signing up a programme of Pillar 2 work which could ultimately extend to others, including Canada and New Zealand.
Sir Desmond Swain.
10, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Royal Navy has a range of capabilities to support the engagement of land-based targets. Specific threat planning is considered for every deployment or contingency, and measures are taken to reduce or mitigate those expected threats as dictated by operational priority.
Sir Desmond.
What urgency is attached to the upgrading of HMS Diamond's defence systems?
Well, my own friend asked an excellent question. I know that there's been a lot of interest following the deployment in the Red Sea and what the lessons are. I can confirm that the Sea Viper capability has, of course, been at the forefront of this, being the Navy's weapon of choice in the first shooting down of an aerial threat in more than 30 years. It is a cutting-edge weapon system, and I can confirm that Sea Viper will be upgraded to further enhance its capability against the more complex and evolving threats we face, including the ability to intercept missiles in their terminal phase.
Lawrence Robertson.
Question number 11, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the year 22-23, the Ministry of Defence spent £25 billion with the UK industry. The most recent estimate shows this supported 209,000 jobs across the country, of which 47,000 were in manufacturing, sir.
Lawrence Robertson.
Thank the Minister for that response. My Tewkesbury constituency contains a lot of aerospace manufacturing, particularly for the defence sectors, but those companies have long complained to me that they can't attract enough young people into their companies, particularly to take engineering jobs. The All-Party Parliamentary Group, which I'm co-chairman of, has as its objective to entice young people into engineering, or at least to consider it as a career. Is there anything more the government can do to persuade young people to consider taking up engineering opportunities, which are there?
Well, my honourable friend asked an excellent question. I think it helps that we have lots of schools and young people in the gallery today, being half-term, but I can confirm that last year's Defence Command paper identifies skills as a priority, including the shortage of engineering, digital, cyber, STEM subjects, nuclear and space-based skills. The Defence Head of Profession for Engineering, who also supports the Government Science and Engineering Head of Profession, has a Defence Youth Engagement Strategy that drives STEM outreach activities and the encouragement of engineering uptake in individuals aged 4 to 14.
Sir Ford.
13, please, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Everything I'd intended to say in response to the honourable gentleman was covered in the supplementary to question 2.
Richard Board, why wasn't he grouped then?
May said of NATO that it existed, amongst other things, to keep the Soviet Union out and the Americans in. The Foreign Secretary was misunderstood on a recent visit to the United States when he proposed that Congress should pass a new military aid package for Ukraine, and he was rebuffed by some Republicans in the House of Representatives. What can the Defence Secretary do to encourage the US to maintain its commitment to Ukraine and to NATO?
Well, Mr. Speaker, again, we covered this earlier, but it's an important issue. The Secretary of State, me, other ministers from the MOD, and indeed from across the whole of government, put our shoulder to the wheel whenever we are in Washington, not only to impress on the US the importance of its continued commitment to Ukrainian security, but also that Euro-Atlantic security is integral to US security, and that the US cannot simply look towards the Pacific. It needs to remain engaged in the Euro-Atlantic in its own interests, as well as those of NATO allies.
Gentleman Preston.
Mr. Speaker, on my last visit to Ukraine a couple of weeks ago, I had several meetings with Ukrainian government ministers who voiced their frustration and their concern about the delay in setting up joint operations with UK defence manufacturers. Is there anything that can I ask my honourable friend to assure the House that he's doing everything possible to speed this process up to allow the Ukrainians to produce their own kit with our help so that they can help in the war?
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State and the Minister for Defence Procurement have both been heavily engaged in this. Indeed, the Minister for Defence Procurement led a delegation to Kyiv to catalyse exactly the idea that the honourable gentleman mentions.
Number 14, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The MOD has already started its decarbonisation journey in support of the UK's net zero commitment. At the Royal International Air to 2 last year, I was pleased to sign the Defence Net Zero Aviation Charter on behalf of MOD. Working closely with our industrial partners, we are moving to cleaner and more efficient technology. The Army is building solar farms and invested £14 million in battlefield electrification. The Royal Navy's cutting-edge catalytic systems are reducing emissions of greenhouse gases in its patrol vessels by up to 97%. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the RAF is pioneering the use of sustainable aviation fuel.
Mr. Speaker, it was a pleasure to attend the Global Charge Dinner last October to see so many members of the armed forces from all ranks committed to tackling the climate crisis. However, the Defence Select Committee has described the MOD's carbon reduction targets as insufficiently demanding under the greening government commitments. They are the lowest across all government. Will the Minister ensure that the next round of CC commitments will contain more demanding targets, not least to reflect the real ambitions for the members of the armed forces on the ground to see the devastation of climate change?
Here, here. Well, I mean, the Honourable Lady makes, I know she's very passionate about this. What I would stress to her, I've just listed the ways in which the individual services are taking steps to reduce their emissions. But of course, we have to always balance that against our overwhelming priorities department, which is to support the ability of our armed forces to defend these islands.
Yes, absolutely.
Redmond Lee.
Dean, sir.
Mr. Speaker, Defence is investing over £6.6 billion in advanced research and development, working with UK industry and academia to identify and invest in innovative technologies, ensuring we have the capabilities we need to defeat our adversaries.
Sir Edward.
Traditionally, the RAF has a very poor record when it closes its bases in Lincolnshire, just walking away and leaving to rack and ruin. But this time, we had wonderful schemes for RAF Scampton in terms of defence innovative technology, such as a spaceport. Will the Minister now work with the Home Office and myself to try and release the bulk of this base so that we can get all these exciting technologies going? The MOD can't just wash its hands of this base now that it's passed it to the Home Office. We're supposed to have joined up government.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. What I would state to him is obviously RAF, as he knows, is no longer part of the defence estate. It means we don't have that formal responsibility for it. What I would stress to him is that we are investing in innovation in Lincolnshire, including, for example, the significant investment into Waddington associated with our protector capability.
Patrick Grady.
Mr. Speaker, number 16.
Worth every penny.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I apologise. The Dreadnought submarine programme remains within overall budget and on track for the first-of-class HMS Dreadnought to enter service in the early 2030s. Inflation has remained higher than expected for an extended period and has had an adverse impact on the cost forecast for the programme when compared to the forecast from a year earlier. As the programme is in its preliminary phases, it is too early to provide cost estimates for the replacement warhead programme.
Patrick Grady.
Speaker, I think what that means is the Minister doesn't know what the total lifetime cost of Trident replacement is going to be. Budgets in government departments and households alike are under immense pressure because of rampant inflation. So why does everybody else's budget have to be under pressure, but the blank cheque seems to be the approach to the renewal of Trident?
Well, it's an extraordinary thing to say by the Honourable Gentleman. He knows we will shortly be publishing before the end of the financial year our supplementary estimate for the defence nuclear enterprise for the financial year. But as he knows, there's a cost in not having a deterrent. That is his policy, to do away with the deterrent on a unilateral basis, despite all the terrible threats we can see in the world and the nuclear sabre rattling from Russia. His policy would be abject folly. We will invest in providing that ultimate guarantee to the people of the United Kingdom.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, I know that the Minister and most of the House, leaving aside the Scottish National benches, would agree with me that continuous at-sea deterrence is an absolutely central part of the defence of the realms. No question about that at all. And would you all agree with me that we must find a way of replacing Trident within budget, and the worst possible thing that could possibly occur to Trident would be an SNP government in Scotland?
I agree 100% with my honourable friend.
We now come to Topicals. Greg Smith.
Mr. Speaker, this year I visited the United States, the White House and Capitol Hill, to lobby on behalf of Ukraine, as discussed today, Saudi Arabia and Egypt for the crisis in the Middle East, HMS Diamond to thank the ship's crew, and also our sovereign base at Docherty to thank the Typhoon pilots. The Cyprus itself was also visited. And last week I was in Brussels at NATO and Munich for the security conference. The whole House will know that defence never sleeps and will wish to join me in thanking the brave men and women who make that possible.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend update the House on progress made at the NATO Defence Ministers' meeting, in particular regard to support for Ukraine?
Indeed, I can. Alongside the NATO meeting was actually the Ukraine Defence Contact Group, which is 52 countries, all of whom support Ukraine. The big concern, of course, is to make sure that Ukraine both has the things it needs now, but also the planning to make sure that in 2024 it can both sustain and push back the fight against the enemy. And that is why the work that this country does, in particular in drones, where I announced £200 million, together with a 15-nation coalition for multinational procurement. That's an initiative called MPI, and also welcomed Australia at my request, who've joined us in the International Fund for Ukraine with $50 million for a fund which is now worth $900 million.
Secretary of State John Healey.
Mr. Speaker, the agonies of the Palestinian people are extreme. We all want to fight. They want the fighting to stop now. Hostages returned now, aid ramped up now, and a ceasefire that lasts permanently. What is the Defence Secretary doing to help his Israeli counterpart accept that their threatened offensive against Rafah just cannot happen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree with the right honourable gentleman about the seriousness of the situation, and as he's just heard, I visited Israel actually just before the new year and had these conversations direct. I believe that it's both in Israel's interest, obviously Gaza's interest, and the world's interest to see this immediate cessation followed by a permanent ceasefire. We are doing everything that we can to both persuade the Israelis of that necessity, but also put pressure on Hamas, who still hold hostages. If they were to release them, this thing could finish very quickly. We're also helping by ensuring that we are working on plans for what happens in the north of the country, or southern Lebanon as well.
Mr. Speaker, Carshallow and Wallington is home to over 1,700 veterans who have and continue to provide amazing service to our great nation. So could the Secretary of State please update me into what steps we are taking as a government to provide better support for veterans in our country?
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend. Since 2011, the Armed Forces Covenant and its consequentials have been the absolute linchpin for public commitment to those who have served, and it has materially improved the lived experience of the service community. The MOD is responsible for a number of services for veterans. The Veterans Welfare Service, for example, supports around 50,000 veterans every year, and the Office for Veterans Affairs coordinates across government to advance support for veterans and their families.
Shadow Minister Steve McCabe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the number of veterans claiming welfare benefits rising steadily and more than 52,000 now in receipt of universal credit, does the Minister find this a cause for celebration or concern?
I am a veteran, Mr. Speaker. I talk to veterans all the time, as does my right honourable friend who heads up the Office of Veterans Affairs, and I don't recognise the picture that he has described. We have, since 2011, materially improved the lived experience of our veteran community and their families, and we will continue to do that. Of that you can be absolutely sure.
Sarah Atherton.
When defence contract bids are awarded, there's a 10 to 20% weighting given to social value. Social value being the benefit that that contract would have to the local and wider community. Could the Minister clarify that this community benefit is entirely for the UK, or are overseas companies and their communities considered equally to the UK?
So it's a very good question, my honourable friend. I think the distinction here, Mr. Speaker, is between the Cabinet Office social value rules, which are applied across government and which are irrespective, and the rules that we apply as the Ministry of Defence for our procurements, which, if, for example, there was discussion of new medium helicopter earlier, when that comes out, as I hope it will soon, it will be clear that we are looking to incentivise a strong commitment to the UK industrial base.
Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The MOD recently published the findings of the inquiry into the fatal accident involving a scimitar fighting vehicle on Salisbury Plain, in which a young soldier tragically lost his life. One of my constituents was witness to the accident, which has inevitably had a profound impact on him. The government has said that it doesn't plan to make a formal response to the inquiry report, which is a harrowing read, but it has accepted all 52 recommendations. Doesn't the Minister think it requires a full and formal response from the Government with a detailed action plan for adopting the 52 recommendations, given the seriousness of the incident and the wider implications for our...
Order, please, just remember it is topical, because I've got to get other members in.
Mr. Speaker, very simply, I actually read the report and, as she rightly points out, accepted all of the findings. We don't usually take it further, but I'll certainly be happy to take a look at the case she raises.
Well, Francois.
Sir, on the subject of recruitment and retention, on the 7th of November, the Chief of the General Staff, Patrick Sanders, arguably the best general of his generation, told the Defence Committee the following, and I quote, "We are taking 400 soldiers out of the field army to put them alongside recruiters because, guess what? It takes a soldier to recruit a soldier." Never a truer word was spoken. So when are we finally going to sack capital?
Well, I thank my right honourable friend for his question. I knew he'd get capita in there somewhere. He will be familiar with Engage to Recruit, which is a programme that's currently underway and has having some success in getting soldiers to recruit soldiers. That's probably why, as I touched upon in my earlier answer, we are seeing now some extremely promising recruiting figures, including in January, the best figures for 6 years.
Clive Betts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Israel so far has ignored international appeals not to attack indiscriminately civilians and not to take steps which are basically razing Gaza to the ground. It now looks as it's going to ignore international opinion about entering Rafah. So has it not now time come for us to consider not selling arms to Israel, which can be used in these totally unacceptable ways?
Well, Mr. Speaker, arms deals and export licences are dealt with in the normal way, but the honourable member will be interested to hear that actually there's not very much arms sales in the direction of Israel that takes place at all. Off the top of my head, I think it was just £42 million last year, and it was mostly protective equipment.
Late last year, diesel got into the water supply at the Trenchard Lines camp near Upavon in my constituency, and I commend the resilience of the families that live there and also of the MOD, which acted very quickly to ensure there was a temporary supply of water. They're still living on that temporary supply, so can the Minister assure me that attention is being given to sorting out this problem and ensuring a permanent supply of clean water?
Well, I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for raising this. He's a champion of the defence community in his constituency. I'm grateful for his early engagement on this. As I understand, following completion of rigorous testing by the local authority regulator, they've confirmed the water quality at Trenchard Lines is acceptable. And as I understand, it is now safe for personnel working and living there to use the main supply. But I will double check and will write to him. But I'm grateful for his comments on the performance of DIO in this regard.
Jeff Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've seen news today of another serious attack by the Houthis on a commercial vessel in the Gulf of Aden. Do ministers think that more Royal Navy ships will need to be deployed to the region, given the ongoing threat to merchant shipping?
Well, the honourable gentleman will be familiar with the answers I gave, I think, last week or the week before at the dispatch box, where I said that we will always look at what's happening in the sea, in the Red Sea. I've been there to meet the crews myself, and we'll make a judgment based on the reality on the ground. We do know, and we welcome now the input from a conglomeration of EU countries who are coming to join Prosperity Guardian as well.
Sir Julian Lewis.
In the debate on the Red Sea on 24th of January, I asked for confirmation that HMS Albion and HMS Bulwark would not only not be scrapped, but would not be mothballed either. The Deputy Foreign Secretary, with the Secretary of State alongside him, said in response that I was absolutely right to detect the supportive view of the Secretary of State for Defence. However, a journalist subsequently was told that nothing had changed by the Ministry of Defence. So are these ships going to be mothballed or not?
Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend can rest easy. I've actually been down since those questions, visited HMS Albion. I can confirm that one of those ships will always be being made ready to sail, and I think he can therefore be very relieved.
Ms. Twist.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Suicide rates amongst veterans under 24 years old are 2 to 4 times as high as in the civilian population. But figures show that this group is less likely to be in touch with mental health services. How will the Minister ensure that young veterans can access the support they need?
grateful for the question, and she's been consistent in her inquiry into this matter. She'll be reassured to know that across the service community, the rate of suicide is lower than we would expect in the civilian population. There is a subset within the serving population among young men where there is an excess, and we're looking very closely at that. And I very much commend to her the suicide action plan that we have published, which lays out what Defence is doing to drive down the suicide rate in our armed forces. Whichever figure it is too high.
James Gray.
Speaker, the whole House, I think, would like to see a larger Army, Navy and Air Force. I have unanimity on that particular point. And central to that must be the Armed Force Recruitment Programme, but also the Army Centralised Training Scheme. Will my honourable friend confirm to me that the pause which was announced last week in the press in capital spending of the MOD will not affect those two schemes, and they will continue in as full-blooded a way as they are at the moment?
My right honourable friend would be pleased to know there is no pause. The approvals are flowing.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The Royal Navy carriers HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales entered service respectively 6 and 7 years late and cost more than 20 times the cost of Scotland's ferries, rocketing to over £8,000 million and plagued with problems and a lack of actual aircraft. What assurances can we have that these hugely expensive carriers will provide the defence capability for which they were designed?
Mr Speaker, I think the whole House recognises the irony of an SNP spokesman talking to us about ships being delivered late. I think the whole House will want to welcome the extraordinary work done by those on HMS Prince of Wales who got the ship ready to leave, not at 30 days readiness, which is what they were ranked for, but in 8 days. And I would have thought congratulating the ship's company would be the right thing to do.
Barry Sherman.
Mr Speaker, does the Secretary of State remember that the British Army used to be the biggest trainer of young men and women in the country? We produced so many skilled people. When can he take us back to those balmy days?
Secretary of State. Well, we have been training since 2014 60,000 Ukrainian troops, proving that we know how to get troops trained. We still train extraordinary numbers, and I think I'm right in saying when it comes to the broader link through to all of the forms of training, we are breaking some of those records as well. We're going to ensure that we have armed forces who are fit for the 21st century.
That completes questions. We now come to the urgent question. Rachel Reeves.
To ask the Chancellor of the Exchequer if he will make a statement on the UK economy entering recession.
Minister.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. High inflation remains the biggest barrier to growth, which is why halving it is still our top priority. Thanks to decisive action supported by the government, inflation has fallen from over 11% to 4%. The Bank of England is forecasting it will fall to around 2% by early summer in only a matter of months, much faster than previously thought. Now, it's important, Mr. Speaker, to put this all in context. Just over a year ago, the Bank of England was forecasting the longest recession in 100 years. That has not happened, Mr. Speaker, and the British economy has proved resilient in the face of unprecedented shocks. Forecasters, including the Bank of England and the IMF, agree that growth will strengthen over the next few years, with the IMF forecasting that we will grow faster than Japan, Germany, France, and Italy, many others, on average over the next 5 years. Wages have been higher than inflation for 6 months in a row. Unemployment remains very low, Mr. Speaker. And we are backing British business by delivering the biggest business tax cut in modern British history and rewarding work by cutting taxes for working people. These are all reasons to be positive about the economy turning a corner. If we stick to our plan, we can be confident in seeing pressures reduce for families and in achieving healthy economic growth. At the autumn statement, we unveiled 110 growth measures, including unlocking £20 billion of business investment. This includes a substantial labour market package, delivering a tax cut to national insurance for 27 million people, reforming pensions, extending investment zones as well. The real risk, to conclude, Mr. Speaker, to economic growth and prosperity in this country is the fact that the Labour Party has no plan for growth, no plan at all. Whilst they may pretend to us here that they've abandoned their £28 billion pledge, they are still committed to their damaging 2030 energy policy, which they themselves, indeed the Leader of the Opposition himself, has said cost £28 billion. All of us across this House know what that means: higher taxes and lower growth with the Labour.
Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rachel Reeves.
Mr. Speaker, the Chancellor should be here in Parliament explaining why Britain has fallen into recession. Can the Minister explain why he has been left to answer these questions, and where exactly is the Chancellor today? The Chancellor should be accountable to MPs and to our constituents and answer for his failure in this House. What an insult to all those people who go to work every day and experience the reality of 14 years of Conservative economic failure that he has simply failed to turn up. So let me ask the Minister, does he accept that the Prime Minister's promise to grow the economy is now in tatters? Will the Minister explain why the economy is now smaller than when the current Prime Minister entered 10 Downing Street? Does the Minister accept the misery that this government has caused homeowners with their kamikaze budget, leaving a typical family renewing their mortgage paying an additional £240 every single month? Now, the Chief Secretary is also notable for her absence today. Last seen refusing or simply failing to recognise that their target measure of debt as a share of GDP is rising, not falling. Following her rebuke this morning from the UK chair of the Statistics Authority about misleading the public, could the Minister inform the House if the Chief Secretary will again be relying on incompetence as her best defence? Mr. Speaker, it's not good enough. The whole country knows that the economy is not working for working people under the Conservatives. It is time for change. And if the government seriously thinks that everything is fine, then why don't they take their record of failure and let the British people decide?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Shadow Chancellor for her questions. But no, it's right. I'm coming on to it. I'm coming on to it. Now, where she started was to talk about the Chancellor. Well, I am the Economic Secretary. I'm perfectly entitled to answer on behalf of the department, and I will do so today. But the main thrust of her remarks was on growth, and let me deal with those in detail. The first point to recognise, Mr. Speaker, is indeed the international context that we all find ourselves in. Well, it happens to be true, Mr. Speaker. And, for example, to describe that international context, 10 EU countries were in recession in 2023. In relation to forecasts, the OBR forecasts originally that there would be a contraction of 1.5% in the economy, and we have significantly outperformed that. The Bank of England, as I have already said, forecast the longest recession in 100 years. We have significantly outperformed that. And wages for 6 months in a row, I think this is the 6th month where this will be the case, are higher than inflation, which, as I've already said, we have more than halved. Now, in relation to the Chief Secretary, what the Chief Secretary was explaining is that, What the Chief Secretary was explaining is that we were and continue to meet our fiscal rule, which is that debt will be falling in the 5th year of the forecast, excluding the Bank of England. And that is what she's explained, and that's what I am reiterating for the House now. And just to finish off, Mr. Speaker, because they don't like hearing this, but they have got absolutely no plan on the economy. We have been clear about our plan, and the plan is starting to bear fruit with wages, with cutting taxes for working people starting in January, with higher business investment as a result of our full expensing put in the autumn statement. And he doesn't have to take it from me, Mr. Speaker. The Office for Budget Responsibility said the 2 fiscal events in 2023, both the budget and the autumn statement, would represent the largest increase to the GDP level that they have ever scored. So what I would say to her, and indeed the House, our plan is working, stick with the plan, don't throw it away with the opposite.
Sir John Redwood.
It is good news that unemployment has stayed low by European standards and the economy is still generating plenty of job vacancies. So will the government take more steps to help more people into those jobs so that we can get faster growth, bring the benefit bill down and boost their incomes?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question, and indeed the whole House knows that he is somewhat of an expert on matters in relation to the economy. What I would say to answer his point very specifically is that national insurance tax cut was scored at the last fiscal event, the autumn statement, to significantly increase the number of people that would be in work as a result. And though I won't, of course, speculate on fiscal events, that point has been very much noted by me and the whole Treasury.
Stuart Hill's in the SNP.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister spoke about resilience, but the 4th quarter contraction in the economy was the biggest quarterly fall since early 2021 at the height of the COVID pandemic. So I'm not sure he's quite right about resilience. He also spoke about growth, but the government told us in November growth is not forecast to exceed 2% in any year in the forecast period. How modest the Minister's ambitions are. The national debt is still approaching 100% of GDP, £3 trillion. The consequences of Brexit are suppressing growth, and this does pose a challenge to the UK government's own fiscal targets. Now, while it is welcome inflation has fallen, prices remain high. Prices are not falling. Prices are simply going up slightly less steeply than they were a month or two ago. It's obvious what the economy needs is growth and the investment to generate that growth. But given business investment, according to the government, is forecast down this year, 5.6%, given private dwelling investment is forecast down this year, 6%, flat at 0% next year, and given general government investment is forecast down in 25, 26, 27 and 28, where is the investment for the growth going to come from?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To take the honourable gentleman, who I deeply respect, his points one by one. The point on resilience, I think that the way how we get resilience for ordinary people and for households is to make sure that real household incomes increase, and since 2010 they are up 12%. In relation to business resilience, that's why we are trying now to increase with our full expensing regime, which is revolutionary in the advanced world. With a full expensing, that will enable more businesses to invest and to deal with a chronic weakness of the British economy, which is weak investment. That's why we're doing that. He mentioned growth. Now, of course, growth is not as high as we would like. Indeed, that is the case across the whole of Europe, across the whole of the industrialised world. That's why the Chancellor, in the last fiscal event, put in place 110 growth measures, Mr. Speaker. So we have a plan for growth over the long term, and we will deliver it. The honourable member mentioned debt. The honourable member mentioned debt. And indeed, that's why, to repeat my point to the Shadow Chancellor, that's why debt is falling in the 5th year. in the 5th year of the forecast, according to our fiscal rule, which is excluding the Bank of England. And that, by the way, was not just the fiscal rule now, it has always been the fiscal rule. And in relation to inflation, yes, he makes the fair point that inflation does not mean that prices are falling. Indeed, inflation, of course, is a lower rate of increase. We all know that in this House. And indeed, that's why bringing down inflation is so important. And the party opposite, with their plan to recklessly jack up borrowing and taxes to the extent of £28 billion, will increase inflation. And to finish my remarks, in relation to investment, just to repeat, investment has been a long-term weakness of the British economy. We are taking long-term measures to deal with it, and I hope that in the next fiscal event in the budget we will continue in that vein.
Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I thank my honourable friend for his distinguished service as a voice of His Majesty's government, and refer him to what the former chief economist of the Bank of England, Andrew Haldane, has said today, referring to a double blow to the credibility of the Bank of England, which was late to put interest rates up and missed inflation, and has been slow to reduce them, hammering the economy. Does my honourable friend agree that the Bank of England is no longer showing itself to be competent and its independence must be questioned?
I don't think I will quite agree with my right honourable friend, but what I will say is that it's very, very important that we leave the Bank of England to do its work, respect their independent mandate, but from the Treasury we do what we can to make sure that we bring inflation down and support them in that mandate. And as I say, the party opposite, their plans, whether they claim that they've dropped them or not, their plans will lead to an increase of borrowing or an increase in taxes that will significantly damage that aim.
Dame Angela Edel.
Well, I think the minister's failing the opposition, the audition. I really do. I think we're not going to take lectures from a person about borrowing when it was 67% of GDP when we left office, and it's now nearly 100%. He's come in here and he's claiming somehow that growth is happening, but we're actually in a recession, which means that there's no growth. In fact, there's negative growth. And if you look, Mr. Speaker, GDP per capita fell in every quarter of last year, meaning that everybody is getting worse off under his appalling stewardship of the economy. Isn't it time that the minister, the junior minister, went back to his boss and told him it's all over, time's up, call the general election?
I thank the right honourable lady. But it is definitely above my pay grade to call elections. What I would say, in relation to the points that she says precisely, are the following. In relation to per capita GDP statistics, and that's an important statistic because the point of that is to try and get a sense as to what's happening to individuals or individual households and families. What I would say to her is I wish the Shadow Chancellor would allow me to respond, is real household incomes, which is as good a measure as any to see what is happening to individuals and families in our economy, is up 12% since 2010. If you're looking at people at the bottom of the income scale, since 2010, the rise in the national living wage that comes in April will mean that there'll be a rise of about 30% in real terms for people on full-time minimum wages. Those two statistics are examples of what's happening to real people on the ground.
Rachel McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for updating the House. And will he agree that obviously people in Redditch and elsewhere are concerned about negative economic news, although it almost always turns out to be wrong later on? But does he agree, most of all, that the greatest risk to my constituents in Redditch and across the country is a Labour government who have said that they can somehow magically get £28 billion of green growth benefits without paying for it? Well, we all know who'll be paying for it is my constituents through extra borrowing and higher taxes.
He has no responsibility for the Labour Party. Let us move on. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government Minister says that the priority for the Government is backing British business, says it's cutting inflation, the priority being reducing the pressure on British families. Why then, when the government also admits this measure will increase inflation, when British business is tearing its hairs out at the chaos that's being caused by not knowing what the charge will be and who will pay it with less than 10 weeks to go, and British consumers will find it causes food shortages and an increase in food prices, why on earth is this government going ahead with the Brexit border tax? And will he here and now commit to cancelling it so that we can stop the inflationary measure? Yes or no?
I thank the Honourable Lady's focus on inflation. Indeed, she's right, inflation is absolutely critical. And bringing it down is an absolute focus for the government. And the House has heard her point in relation to the European Union. But what I would add is simply to say that we have a clear plan for bringing down inflation that we have carried out, that we'll continue to carry out. And she's got to ask her front bench why they don't have one.
Sir Edward Lee.
For too long, too many people in the Treasury, not my honourable friend, who's an excellent minister, but too many people there have thought the best way to grow the economy was to fill the country with more and more people. So will the government now commit itself, or recommit itself, to insisting that if you come here to work, you should earn average UK earnings of around £33,000 a year? No shortage schemes, no exemption for care workers or the NHS, that in those sectors we pay proper wages, we get people off benefit, there's too many people on benefit dragging down our economy, we cut seriously mass legal migration, and by the way, if there is a general election, we give something for our people to vote for.
My honourable friend makes an important point about migration, and I completely agree with him that what we need to see is an economy where we get higher earnings for British people. That does not mean we have an economy where we import too many people and keep earnings down. That's why we've been focusing on raising the national living wage. That's why we're focusing on making sure that ordinary household incomes, as I've already explained, are going to go up as a result of this government's policies. And what is also worth pointing out to the House is that in relation to, for example, last year's immigration numbers, obviously there were certain individual things that happened last year, in particular people fleeing from Ukraine, in particular people from Hong Kong as well, that meant that last year's were particularly high immigration numbers, but the broad thrust of what he says is correct. We want a high-skill, high-wage economy.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I don't know if the Minister realises quite how infuriating people find watching his government tell them that everything is fine and it's all going really well and there's nothing to see here, when what they're experiencing every day is the fact that they're feeling poorer and small businesses are closing. So if the Prime Minister and Chancellor can't face reality, how on earth can anyone trust them to solve the economic crisis their government created?
I'd like to be clear with the Honourable Lady, who I've got a huge amount of time for and is a very good Member of Parliament, that it is not our position that everything is okay. It is our position that we have been in a very challenging international context. There's been a once-in-a-100-year pandemic. There was an energy crisis caused by Putin's war in the Ukraine. And this government has done everything we possibly can to build an economy for growth. That's what we're doing, and I hope to get her support in us doing so.
Sir Desmond Swain.
What distinguishes this recession is the 800 jobs for every day that have been created since this government came to power in 2010. The very antithesis of anything ever achieved by a Labour government, which has always left unemployment higher than it found it, isn't it?
It is, Mr. Speaker, and I would add something else. If you look at something, for example, like a statistic such as home repossessions, much higher when there was a recession, when the Labour Party was in office in 2008-9, comparison with our record now. Unemployment now, much lower than in the recession that we saw under the Labour government in 2008-9. And our record, though we are in challenging times, the economy is turning a corner, our record does compare very favourably with theirs.
Now, the Chancellor said last May that he was comfortable with the prospect of a recession, and now that my constituents in Selby and Ainsty are suffering under that recession's effect, would the Minister chalk it up as a job well done?
He'll do well this time, that gentleman. What I would say is there is nobody on this side of the House who welcomes adverse economic situation for anybody. That's why we are doing everything we can, straining every sinew to grow the economy. And that's why all the measures that I've laid out so far will continue, and they are put at risk, I'm afraid, by his front bench being in office.
Duncan Baker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Before I came into this House, I was actually a director of quite a large retail group in North Norfolk, and a point that absolutely nobody has made is that in the last quarter of the year, Babette, Kieran, Debbie, Elgin, Fergus and Gerrit, 6 major storms and floods that the country saw. In the previous year, how many were there? Absolutely none at all. So can the Economic Secretary tell everybody, of course you are not going to have an economy functioning properly when they are in a grip of storms and floods every fortnight, and we are not in a recession. The more we talk it up, the more we will be.
I thank my honourable friend for that, and I would say that large retail groups in Norfolk's loss is the House's gain. The point he makes about the international context, however, is a really serious and important one, because though the honourable members opposite don't like to hear it, if one faces a once-in-a-100-year pandemic and Putin's illegal war in Ukraine that sees energy prices skyrocket, that will have adverse impacts on the economy. The country understands that, the House understands that, and the Labour front bench should also understand that.
This recession is a direct result by the choices that this government has made. Years of potential for growth have been missed, and the government has particularly failed to capitalise on the green transition. Green investment will be worth $1 trillion by 2030 globally, including 500,000 jobs in this country. When will the government bring forward a green investment programme to match the one in the US or in Europe?
Hear, hear.
I thank the honourable lady for that point. The first point I make to her is that when you look at our record on decarbonisation, it beats anywhere else in the G7. So we've got we don't take lessons from the United States or any other country in that regard. But in relation to the green investment plan by 2030 that she mentions, I would ask her to she should direct her ire at the Labour front bench for not being clear as to what their plan actually is. Then the leader of the opposition says that, well, it's important because this politics is about a contest of ideas, Mr. Speaker, as indeed it is as about a contest between two parties. And if the party opposite believes that they can spend an extra £28 billion without having an impact of taxes and borrowing, then they are trying to pull the wool over the eyes of the British people.
Forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The past couple of years have been very difficult economically, and I certainly do not treat the state of our economy as the giggle feast that the Labour members seem to be having today. Over the past few weeks, I've met many businesses in my constituency, large and small, and a number of them have told me that they feel that the conditions are getting better, that demand is growing and orders are coming back. Constituents have also told me that they have noticed food prices dropping in our supermarkets. Does the Minister agree with me that the most damaging thing that could happen to our economy now would be if politicians on the benches opposite continue to talk our economy down?
I thank my right honourable gentleman, and indeed she's correct. Forgive me, I thank the right honourable lady. Indeed, she is correct that things are starting to get better for many, many people across the country, indeed small businesses, because inflation is now down below 4%. We've more than halved inflation. We think that in the coming months it will go to 2%, the target. And of course, once it hits that target, we hope that interest rates will start coming down, which will make a big, big difference to ordinary people up and down this country.
Sir Stephen Timms.
Mr. Speaker, I applaud the Minister's willingness to take on this unenviable assignment, unlike his right honourable friends. The international context that he's referred to is that Japan and UK are the only G7 countries in recession. Inflation that he's referred to is the highest in the UK of the whole of the G7. Why is it that the UK economy is doing so much worse than comparable economies elsewhere?
The Right Honourable Gentleman's point is an interesting one, but I would say the following. When our economy entered difficult times is at a different point in the cycle to when certain other economies did. So really, to assess fully the performance of all economies, we have to wait for the end of this whole period to assess it. So I wouldn't prejudge exactly at this stage. And what I would also say to him is simply that when we are in the difficulties that we're in, they have affected absolutely every single economy. The nature of different economies affects them at different times, but we are putting in place comprehensive growth measures, comprehensive measures to bring inflation down. I would also note that interest rates are roughly middle of the pack in the UK compared with other jurisdictions of countries of comparable size. But indeed, we'll keep all of this under review, and at the next fiscal event, we will take further measures to increase our potential growth rate over the long term.
Alexander Staff.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister welcome the news the South Yorkshire Mayor has finally recognised the economic importance of Doncaster Airport and is at last starting to use the powers given to him to get that airport up and running again and start that process? But does he agree with me that it's taken far too long, it's taken years since the airport closed, and the South Yorkshire Mayor should have used those powers years ago rather than waiting 9 weeks until he's re-elected?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for pointing out once again what a brilliant champion he is for his constituency, and I'm sure his constituents have heard that comment and he will continue to make that point.
Sir Christopher Bryan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lordy, Lordy. I mean, it really is. It's like listening to the Red Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass, who invented 6 impossible things before breakfast. How on earth can we have confidence in what the Minister is saying, considering that the UK Statistics Authority has had to tell off the Chief Secretary to the Treasury for saying that, for making false claims about tax cuts, when Evan Davis had to school her at length, and she refused even to understand, I think, by the end, how wrong she was about debt falling as a percentage of GDP when it's going up. And when he himself actually said the NHS is 42 to 43% of everything the government spends, when it's only 15%. Can he just confirm one fact? These 2 years will see the biggest fall in living standards since records began. And that's why people are going to vote them out, isn't it?
I've already explained the Chief Secretary's comments, and in relation to my own, I was referring to current spending, not overall spending, and I clarified that as well. But look, there has been difficulties for so many millions of people across the country, and I've never sought to minimise that from this position or any other position in the House, as the Right Honourable Gentleman knows. But we have faced once in 100-year challenges that this government has faced and taken the right action to deal with. Cost of living support package over £100 billion to the tune of over £3,700 per person. We have dealt with these challenges, and we've got a plan now to grow the economy, grow our way out of them. And I'm afraid the members opposite in the front bench opposite does not have that sort of plan, and that's why I would not make the assumption that he makes about the election.
Scott Benson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The number of those who are on long-term sickness benefits in Blackpool has increased fourfold over the last few decades. This represents an enormous loss of potential and is also hurting economic growth and productivity. The government's proposed reforms in this area are to be welcome, but rather than delaying them until next year, what's preventing the government bringing those in this year?
I will take that point away, but what I would say is, of course, the next financial year, I think, is what he's referring to. And indeed, at the next fiscal event, the budget, the Chancellor will bear what he's said in mind.
Thank you,
Mr. Speaker. 14 years of Conservative mismanagement of the economy are having disastrous impacts on working people. For example, musicians are waiting months to be paid because HMRC is failing to produce A1 forms on time for musicians touring to Europe. The trade body Live told me that in one case, 26 musicians, performers and sound engineers had not been paid over 3 months after their tour to Spain due to delays in processing A1 forms. Even worse, in response to written questions, I've been told that service standards for these forms will not be met by HMRC until at least April 2024. Does this Minister agree that these delays are totally unacceptable, particularly when our musicians are having to cope already with a challenging financial landscape, made worse now by news of the recession?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her point, and I agree that we need to speed up the processing of A1 forms as she has described, and I'm sure that the Treasury has heard that, and indeed I'll make sure that my ministerial colleagues also take what she said very seriously indeed.
Mr. Robert.
And whatever spin the government puts on it, forecasts show that the economy has now officially entered recession. But the reality out there for people is that they've been suffering grinding economic pressure for years. Average energy bills are 59% higher than they were in 2022, and over 600,000 Welsh households are in fuel poverty. Meanwhile, profits of energy companies such as British Gas have increased tenfold to £750 million. This is the Minister's chance to make a difference to every household. Talking about the next fiscal event, will he act to extend and bring backdate even, the windfall tax on energy companies which are presently profiteering from households everywhere?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Lady is right that many people have had very challenging times over the last couple of years. But what I would say to her, and I would correct something I previously said to the House, Mr. Speaker, is that the increase to real household income since 2010 is actually 8%, and the increase to GDP per capita is 12%. I want to put that on the record. And in relation to taxes, I can't speculate about taxes at the next fiscal event.
Mr. Speaker, the forecast says that debt is going to be higher than it currently is in 5 years' time. Is that a reasonable time to be talking about tax cuts? And doing so, doesn't that suggest that the government learned nothing from the budget of September 2022?
I would assure the Honourable Gentleman that this Chancellor and this government is very different to the one in September 2022 that he refers. And in relation to debt, I'll repeat the point that we are keeping to our fiscal rule, which is, and has always been, that debt will be falling in the 5th year of the forecast, falling once you exclude the Bank of England. That has always been our position, and it will continue to be the case.
Make no mention of the importance to the UK Treasury of North Sea oil, and indeed the danger to the Scottish economy of the closure of Grangemouth refinery. Given that the UK Treasury received £8 billion in revenues from the North Sea last year and is expected to receive £6.1 billion in revenues this year, can they not find the tens of millions, not tens of billions, that they'll get from revenue to ensure that the hydrocracker can be restarted and the profitability of the refinery increased threefold?
Hear, hear.
The Honourable Gentleman's specific point I will take away, and I'll make sure that the Treasury gets back to him. But the broader point about offshore oil and gas in the North Sea is a very important one. It is absolutely critical that we support that sector, and it is absolutely critical that we, not just, by the way, for tax revenues, but for the livelihoods and prosperity of the United Kingdom. And indeed, this government stands full square behind the oil and gas sector.
Debbie Abrahams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there's overwhelming evidence that the lower the economic inequalities, the higher economic growth is. But we know from the ONS that between 2021 and 2022, the poorest fifth of households had their disposable income shrink by 3.4%, while the richest fifth of households had their disposable income increased by a corresponding 3.3%. And this reflected the last 10 years before that. So what assessment has the Minister or the Chancellor undertaken to estimate the impacts of these increasing inequalities on our shrinking growth?
In relation to people at the bottom end of the income scale, it's really important that the House knows that since 2010, people on full-time national living wage, which we're doing the biggest increase for, which will come in April of this year, will be 30% better off than they were in 2010.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
News that the UK is officially in recession comes as no surprise to my constituents in Warrington North, who have been battered by this Tory cost of living crisis. Food inflation is still double the headline rate of inflation, something that is not only affecting the price of the weekly shop, but having a hugely negative effect on my local pub and hospitality sector, with many businesses on the brink. Instead of the fantasyland spinning that everything is going fine, what measures will they actually bring in to bring food inflation down?
Inflation, and I've said it many times in this dispatch box this afternoon, is absolute target for this government to make sure we continue to bring it down, and indeed in the coming months we expect it to get to 2%. But in relation to food inflation specifically, one thing that we are doing is by bringing in at the last fiscal event full expensing, which will enable the manufacturers of food and supermarkets and others to invest, to hugely increase their investment, because it completely nets off against their tax. So 100% investment that gets netted off. The impact of that will be increased investment that will reduce their cost, that will reduce the cost of food in our shops. And so that's the sort of measure, amongst many others, that's the sort of measure that we're putting in place to reduce food inflation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said he was going to grow the economy, and he's obviously failed. We're now in recession. And in my constituency, families and small businesses are under severe pressure. Can the Minister possibly explain how he's going to address these very serious problems?
All I would say to the honourable gentleman is that we are in a very challenging international context. We have performed better than the international forecasters. We have high inflation, which really bedeviled this economy a couple of years ago. We have brought down more, we have more than halved. And then we have a plan to grow our way out of it, as indeed shown by the last fiscal event, where we unveiled over 110 growth measures. That is our plan. The Labour opposition doesn't have a plan, and we will see if this country sticks with our plan, we will grow our economy significantly over the coming months and years.
Patrick Ready.
He keeps trying to hide behind the war in Ukraine and the impact of the pandemic, but the reality is that those are affecting every country in the world. The exacerbating factor, the thing that has led most to economic decline, to massive labour shortages, and to rampant inflation here in the UK, will he not admit, is Brexit?
No, I would not, Mr. Speaker.
Dave Johnson.
Is in recession, and the consequences for the public finances are not the fault of those people like the infected and affected through the contaminated blood scandal, the largest treatment disaster in the NHS. So can the Minister just confirm, as I was hoping to ask the Chancellor, whether money has already been ring-fenced to pay compensation to those people as set out in the final recommendations on compensation by Sir Brian Langstaff in April 2023?
I believe at the last Treasury questions, the Honourable Lady asked a similar question of the Chancellor, and the Chancellor responded by saying that he is absolutely clear about the need to compensate people in the way that the Honourable Lady has described, and he will update the House in due course, and indeed update her in due course, further details in response to that.
Neil Griffith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, the Prime Minister has absolutely failed to get growth, and industry has completely lost confidence in this government, with projects cancelled, HS2 cancelled, Schools of the Future cancelled, hospitals never built, and an absolute failure to bring down high energy prices. No wonder business investment forecast is down. So with the US and EU incentivising investment, what is he now going to do to get the investment we need in the green manufacturing industries of the future?
What we've done to increase investment, Mr. Speaker, is by bringing in full expensing at the last fiscal event, which should represent an increase of £14 billion over the forecast period of investment, dealing with the chronic weakness of our economy over generations. So that's what we're going to do to increase investment. And in relation to green investment in particular, what we are not doing is having a huge unfunded £28 billion plan, or maybe now it isn't their plan, maybe it's a secret plan, or maybe they've stopped their plan, but plan that the Labour front bench has. We have a responsible, costed plan to increase investment. They don't have one.
In Wakeford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let's try this again. Public sector net debt is set to rise from 89% of GDP this year to 92.8% of GDP in 28-29. That's according to the most recent OBR forecast. Now, in case the Minister doesn't understand, that number is higher than today. So the Prime Minister promised to reduce debt. It's increasing. The plan isn't working, is it?
What the Prime Minister is committed to doing, and indeed the whole government is committed to doing, is to reduce debt as we get to the end of this economic period, this forecast period, which is what we are doing.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do think the Minister's rosy picture of the economy shows a complete lack of awareness of what is actually going on in the country. And his claim that the Labour Party is somehow a risky party that's just took the country into recession shows a complete lack of self-awareness as well. And that's the number of this. We are going into recession, and yet the Chancellor is nowhere to be seen. I would have thought this was important enough for him to be here today to answer questions. But my question to the Minister is, given growing the economy is yet another pledge of the Prime Minister's that hasn't been met, who does he think should carry the can for this failure? Is it the Prime Minister or is it the Chancellor?
His criticism about my self-awareness, I'll just have to take on the chin, Mr. Speaker. But the broader point that he's making is a serious one, which is whether me or this government somehow is light-hearted or thinks that everything is absolutely fantastic around the economy. It is not. That is why we've taken the measures that we have. That is why we are cutting tax for working people beginning in January. That is why we're increasing business investment. That is why we had an over £100 billion cost of living support package, because we know how much many people ordinary people are suffering in this country. That is why we are trying to grow our economy overall, because that will result in higher prosperity for the country and more money for our public services. That's all put at risk, Mr. Speaker, by the party opposite.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. The government is failing. An 81-year-old constituent has said to me he can't ever remember the economy and living standards being this bad. Can the Minister not see that under his government, Britain is worse off?
I don't agree with the Honourable Lady. I won't repeat everything I just said to the response to the last question, but I would say that under this government and this Treasury, there is a plan for growth that we are sticking to, and that is all put at risk with the party opposite.
Richard Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Office for Budget Responsibility assessed Boris Johnson's trade and cooperation agreement at the beginning of last year. The trading relationship between the UK and the EU as set out in the TCA is said by the Office for Budget Responsibility to have reduced long-run productivity by 4%. Why does he think that is?
Well, I would say to the honourable gentleman that the trade and cooperation agreement is something that we built on with the Windsor Framework. It's something that the opposition doesn't propose to change, and indeed is fundamental to our stability in relation with our relationship with the European Union, that I don't think at this time the country would benefit from unpicking once again.
Jim Shannon.
Mr. Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for all of his answers? They weren't easy. The Office for National Statistics have revealed that there has been a 0.3% decline in GDP between October and December last year. And given that the strengthening of the economy was and still is one of the Prime Minister's pledges, what steps is the Minister taking to reverse this decline and to reinstil confidence back into government economic plans?
The steps we are taking I've already laid out in this session so far, but I will add one thing, which is to say that there is a critical need to make sure that all the regions of our country benefit from the steps that we are taking. It's one of the reasons why we've put so much effort and focus into investment zones over the last couple of years. We hope that these investment zones are going to continue to increase growth in the economy, but not just increase growth at a macro level, increase them for people in all of the regions of this country, particularly Northern Ireland, and other regions that have in the past maybe not benefited from the growth of this country. And it's something that regionally we are very committed to strengthening.
That completes the urgent question. We now come to the statement on the Post Office. Secretary of State.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I wish to make a statement on Post Office governance and Horizon compensation schemes. Mr. Speaker, several serious allegations were made against the government, my department and its officials by Henry Staunton, the former chair of the Post Office, over the weekend. These allegations are completely false, and I would like to make a statement to the House so that honourable members and the British public know the truth about exactly what has happened. I would like to address three specific claims that Mr. Staunton made in his Sunday Times interview, claims which are patently untrue. First, Mr. Staunton alleges that I refused to apologise to him after he learnt of his dismissal from Sky News. That was not the case. In the call he referenced, I made it abundantly clear that I disapproved of the media breaking any aspect of this story. And out of respect for Henry Staunton's reputation, I went to great pains to make my concerns about his conduct private. In fact, in my interviews with the press, I repeatedly said that I refused to carry out HR in public. That is why it is so disappointing that he's chosen to spread a series of falsehoods, provide made-up anecdotes to journalists, and leak discussions held in confidence. All of this merely confirms in my mind that I made the correct decision in dismissing him. Second, Mr. Staunton claimed I told him that someone's got to take the rap for the Horizon scandal, and that was the reason for his dismissal. That was not the reason at all. I dismissed him because there were serious concerns about his behaviour as chair, including those raised from other directors on the board. My department found significant governance issues, for example, with the recruitment of a new senior independent director to the Post Office board. A public appointment process was underway, but Mr. Staunton apparently wanted to bypass it, appointing someone from within the existing board without due process. He failed to properly consult the Post Office board on the proposal. He failed to hold the required nominations committee. Most importantly, he failed to consult the government as a shareholder, which the company was required to do. I know that honourable members will agree with me that such a cavalier approach to governance was the last thing we needed in the Post Office, given its historic failings. I should also inform the House that while he was in post, a formal investigation was launched into allegations made regarding Mr. Staunton's conduct. This included serious matters such as bullying. Concerns were brought to my department's attention about Mr. Staunton's willingness to cooperate with that investigation. So it is right that the British public know the facts behind this case and what was said in the phone call where I dismissed Mr. Staunton. Officials from my department were on the line. It was minuted, and a readout was sent after it took place. Today, I am depositing a copy of that readout in both libraries of the House so the honourable members and the public can see the truth. Personal information relating to other Post Office employees in those minutes have been redacted. It is for all of these reasons that an interim chair will be appointed shortly, and I will of course update the House when we have further details. Finally, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Staunton claimed that when he was first appointed as chair of the Post Office, he was told by a senior civil servant to stall on paying compensation. There is no evidence whatsoever that this is true. In fact, on becoming Post Office chair, Mr. Staunton received a letter from the Bay's Permanent Secretary, Sarah Mumby, on the 9th of December 2022. It welcomed him to his role, making it crystal clear that successfully reaching settlements with victims of the Post Office scandal should be one of his highest priorities. That letter is in the public domain. The words are there in black and white, and copies of the correspondence will be placed in the libraries of both houses. The reality is that my department has done everything it can to speed up compensation payments for victims. We've already made payments totaling £160 million across all 3 compensation schemes. That includes our announcement last autumn of the optional £600,000 fixed sum award for those who've been wrongfully convicted. It's the strongest refutation, Mr. Speaker, of those in this House who would claim that we only acted after the ITV drama, Mr. Bates versus the Post Office. British people should know that a dedicated team of ministers and civil servants have been working around the clock for many months to hasten the pursuit of justice and bring swift, fair redress to all those affected. To that end, I am pleased that all 2,417 postmasters who claimed through the original Horizon shortfall scheme have now had offers of compensation, and the Post Office is dealing promptly with late applications in cases where the initial offer has not been accepted. My department has also established the Horizon Compensation Unit to ensure that money gets to the right people without a moment's delay. And we announced this autumn an additional £150 million to the Post Office specifically to help them meet the costs of participating in the Post Office Horizon inquiry and deliver compensation to postmasters. In all, we've committed around £1 billion to ensure wronged postmasters can be fully and fairly compensated. And we are taking unprecedented steps with the forthcoming legislation to quash convictions of postmasters affected by the Horizon scandal. In short, Mr. Speaker, we are putting our money where our mouth is and our shoulders to the wheel in ensuring that justice is done. It is not fair on the victims of this scandal, which has already ruined so many lives and livelihoods, to claim, as Mr. Staunton has done, that this is being dragged out a second longer than it ought to be. For Henry Staunton to suggest otherwise, for whatever personal motives, is a disgrace, and it risks damaging confidence in the compensation schemes which ministers and civil servants are working so hard to deliver. I would hope that most people reading the interview in yesterday's Sunday Times would see it for what it was, a blatant attempt to seek revenge following dismissal. Mr. Speaker, I must say that I regret the way in which these events have unfolded. We did everything we could to manage this dismissal in a dignified way for Mr. Staunton and others. However, I will not hesitate to defend myself and, more importantly, my officials who cannot respond directly to these baseless attacks. Right now, the Post Office's #1 priority must be delivering compensation to postmasters who have not already been compensated, those that fell victim to a faulty IT system they implemented and which they turned a blind eye to when brave whistleblowers like Alan Bates sounded the alarm. We said that the government would leave no stone unturned in uncovering the truth behind the Horizon scandal and pursuing justice for the victims and their families. We are delivering on that promise while looking for any further possible steps we can take so full and final settlement claims can be reached as quickly as possible. It is right that we reflect too on the cultural practices at the Post Office which allowed the Horizon scandal to happen in the first place, a culture which let those in the highest ranks of the organisation arbitrarily dismiss the very real concerns of the sub-postmasters who are the lifeblood of their business and pillars of the local community. While the Post Office may have failed to stand by its postmasters in the past, we are ensuring that they do everything they can to champion them today, fostering an environment that respects their employees and respects their customers. That is how we will rebuild trust and ensure that the British public can have confidence in our Post Office now and in the future. I commend this statement to the House.
Under Secretary of State Jonathan Reynolds.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I firmly agree that the revelations in the Sunday Times at the weekend could not be more serious. In particular, the claim that the Post Office was instructed to deliberately go slow on compensation payments to sub-postmasters in order to push the financial liability into the next Parliament, if true, would be a further outrageous insult to a scandal that has already rocked faith in the fairness of the British state. It cannot be allowed to stand if it is the case, and if it is not, it must be shown to be false in no uncertain terms. Yet we do now have two completely contrasting accounts, one from the former chair of the Post Office and one from the Secretary of State, and only one of these accounts can be the truth. And I hope we're all in agreement that Parliament is the correct place for these matters to be raised and clarified, because what we need now is transparency and scrutiny. So can I ask the Secretary of State, will she categorically state that the Post Office was at no point told to delay compensation payments by either an official or a minister from any government department? And at no point was it alluded to that a delay would be of benefit to the Treasury? Will there now be a Cabinet Office investigation to ensure that no such instruction or inference was given at any point? Crucially, is the £1 billion figure of compensation, which the Secretary of State quite helpfully just repeated, already allocated and sat in the Department of Business and Trade's accounts, ready to be paid? If it is not, will we see compensation payments itemised specifically in the upcoming budget? The Secretary of State will also understand that following the story at the weekend, victims of other scandals, especially contaminated blood, now feel that they need to ask the question as to whether they have been the victims of deliberate inaction. Can the government provide assurances that no such obstruction has been placed on any payments of that kind? And if so, what is the delay with some of these cases? And in the full interests of transparency and to fully ascertain the veracity of any allegations for sub-postmasters and the general public, will she publish all relevant correspondence and minutes of meetings between the Department, the Treasury, UKGI and the Post Office during this time? And finally, when can we expect the legislation on exonerations that was promised by the Prime Minister? I cannot stress enough how the last thing that was needed in this scandal was any further allegations of cover-ups or obfuscation at the very top of government. People's faith in government, already damaged from scandals like Hillsborough and Bloody Sunday and Windrush, is hanging by a thread. And this miscarriage of justice has shown the devastation that can occur when institutions are allowed to operate without oversight or are shrouded by secrecy. So we should all agree that that secrecy must end and the full sunlight of public scrutiny brought to bear. And if everything the Secretary of State has told us today is correct, surely there will be no objection to that happening in full.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I would like to very much welcome the tone that the shadow frontbench spokesman has taken on this. I know that there are often tendencies for political point scoring, but I think we both agree that this is very much about the postmasters, and that is why I made sure that I was at this dispatch box so that people would know the truth. That is what builds trust. So he asked if I would categorically state that no instruction was given to delay payments. Yes, I can. We have no evidence whatsoever that any official said this. And actually, if such a thing was said, it is for Mr. Staunton himself to bring the evidence. It's very hard to refute a negative. People just making wild, baseless accusations and then demanding proof that they didn't happen are mischief-making in my view. So as far as I have seen, and all the evidence points to the fact that no one made this claim. But also, I think it's important to look at whether it would even make sense to do so. There would be no benefit whatsoever of us delaying compensation. This does not have any significant impact on revenues whatsoever. It would be a mad thing to even suggest. And the compensation scheme, which Mr. Staunton oversaw, has actually been completed. My understanding is that 100% of payments have been made, so clearly no instruction was given. And he mentions the infected blood inquiry. I think that this is a good example of how people lose faith in the system because of misinformation that is put out there, and that is why I'm here to correct the record. He asked about the £1 billion allocation. We give monthly reports that show exactly what payments are being made. And he also asked about whether we would be publishing correspondence. No, we will not be publishing in full all correspondence between departments and UKGI and the Post Office. That is because we set up the statutory inquiry that will examine those important issues relating to the Horizon scandal and examine current governance arrangements. So we are fully cooperating with the inquiry, but the inquiry was set up specifically to look at that by Parliament. And in addition to the readout of the true content of my telephone call with Mr. Staunton, we will consider publishing correspondence between departments and Mr. Staunton in accordance with Freedom of Information rules so that people will know exactly what happened contrary to the account that he has given.